The state trooper woke up to the crackling sound of flames. At first he thought he was dreaming, maybe hearing a campfire or a barbecue. But as thick smoke filled the air, he quickly realized something was terribly wrong. His police car, parked in his driveway, was on fire. His heart raced and he rushed to the window, his chest tightening with panic. The car was completely engulfed in flames. It was too late to save it. The heat hit his face as anger and shock surged through him. He knew there was nothing he could do now. The state trooper stood frozen, staring in disbelief as his police car burned in the driveway. Then he heard laughter from across the street. His heart sank as he turned and saw the HOA members gathered on a well-kept lawn. Mrs. Pennington, the HOA president, stood at the front, grinning with a glass of wine in her hand. They were laughing as if they were celebrating the destruction of his vehicle. His stomach turned as he realized the truth. They were celebrating. "Next time, follow the rules, Mr. Dawson," Mrs. Pennington called out in a sweet, mocking tone. "Maybe you'll learn to keep your car out of sight." Anger bubbled up inside him as he clenched his fists. He'd had enough of their control. The HOA had been a constant annoyance ever since he moved into the neighborhood. A few weeks ago they had knocked on his door, pretending to be friendly, but it quickly turned into a veiled threat. They made it clear that joining their rules was highly encouraged. But to him, it sounded more like a demand for control over his life. They wanted to dictate everything, from where he parked his car to how his lawn looked. He had politely refused their offer to join. He wasn't interested in their petty rules. But they didn't like being told no. The fines started coming in fast. The first one was because his grass had grown a little too long. The next, a $500 fine, was for his police motorcycle being non-compliant and needing to be stored out of sight. He had laughed at that one, tossing it in the trash, convinced they couldn't control him. But their harassment didn't stop. They began sending more fines, each one more ridiculous than the last. They tried to control how he lived, pushing him to comply with their ridiculous rules. Each time he rejected them and the tension between them grew. Now here they were, standing across the street, laughing at the fire they had set. They thought they could get away with it because he wasn't part of their little group. They had no idea who they were messing with. After the fire was put out, the state trooper went inside and sat down to watch the security footage from his cameras. His hands shook as he rewound the tape, hoping to see something, anything that would explain what had happened. What he saw made his blood run cold. The footage clearly showed the HOA members sneaking onto his property in the middle of the night. There was Mrs. Pennington, standing next to a man he recognized from the neighborhood. She was holding a gas can, and he could see them pouring gasoline over his police car. The flames ignited quickly after one of them, a woman he didn't know, struck a match and threw it onto the car. He could see them laughing as they stood back, watching the fire grow. They acted like they were celebrating, thinking they'd gotten away with something. The realization hit him hard. This wasn't just some petty vandalism. They had committed arson, setting fire to a state-owned police vehicle. That wasn't just a crime, it was a federal offense. They had no idea who they were messing with. To them he was just another guy with a police car. But they didn't know he was a state trooper with jurisdiction far beyond the small neighborhood they thought they controlled. As he watched the footage again, he felt a slow burn of rage inside him. These people had gone too far. They had crossed a line that could send them to prison for a long time. And they had no idea what they'd done. He knew what he had to do. He wasn't going to let them get away with this. He started making plans. He called his buddy, Officer Martinez, and explained everything. Martinez was just as shocked as he was but promised to help with the paperwork. The next step was clear. He would use his position and the law to bring these people down. The HOA thought they could play God over the neighborhood, but they had no idea how deep they were in trouble now. The trooper smiled to himself, knowing this was only the beginning. The HOA was about to face the consequences of their actions. The next morning, the state trooper walked outside, his steps steady but filled with purpose. He could see the HOA board gathered near the community garden, chatting and gossiping as usual. Mrs. Pennington was standing at the center, smiling and talking to the others like she was in control. It was time to confront them. He walked over, his eyes locked on them. They didn't notice him at first, caught up in their conversation. He stood there for a moment, watching them laugh and talk, all the while knowing what they had done. Finally, Mrs. Pennington noticed him standing there. Her smile faded as she recognized him. "Oh, Mr. Dawson," she said, forcing a polite tone, "I hope everything's been taken care of." The trooper didn't reply right away. Instead, he casually flipped open his badge and let the sunlight glint off it. The expression on Mrs. Pennington's face shifted instantly. Her confident smile disappeared, and her eyes widened with shock. The other board members who had been laughing froze in place. The trooper let the silence hang for a moment, enjoying the sudden shift in power. "Actually, Mrs. Pennington, I'd love to discuss what happened last night. Maybe we could head over to the station?" he said, his voice calm and almost playful. The other members looked uncomfortable, glancing at each other nervously. Mrs. Pennington's face drained of color as the realization hit her. "The station?" she stammered. "What do you mean?" He smiled, his gaze unwavering. "Well, it turns out you and your little group of friends committed arson. And not just any arson, a federal crime, since you burned a state-owned vehicle." The panic was immediate. Mrs. Pennington took a step back, her hands trembling slightly. The other HOA members shifted uncomfortably, their earlier confidence completely gone. They had thought they were untouchable, that no one would ever stand up to them. But now their world was crashing down. The trooper couldn't help but relish the moment. Their arrogance had led them to make a massive mistake. They had thought they were above the law, but now they were facing the consequences. He knew it was only a matter of time before they were held accountable for their actions. The tables had turned, and it was time for them to face the truth. The state trooper wasted no time. After his confrontation with the HOA board, he immediately contacted his colleague, Officer Martinez. He explained everything, the arson, the footage, and how the HOA members had no idea what they had just done. Martinez was shocked but promised to help. He said he'd start handling the legal paperwork right away. The trooper sat back, feeling a sense of calm wash over him as he knew this was only the beginning. He had done his part in exposing the HOA's crime, and now it was time for the law to take over. As the hours passed, he kept his eyes on the security footage, making sure everything was in order. He wasn't going to let them escape the consequences. By mid-morning, Officer Martinez called back with good news. He had already arranged everything with the district attorney, and arrest warrants had been issued for the HOA members. The trooper felt a wave of satisfaction. This was no longer just about revenge, this was about justice. The officers arrived at the HOA members' homes, one by one. The trooper watched from his porch as the first few were taken into custody. He could hear the sirens and see the flashing lights in the distance. It was all happening so fast, and the realization hit him that these people were no longer in control. The neighborhood was about to change. The HOA members were arrested and charged with federal arson. As the officers led them away, the community started to buzz with excitement. People were talking about the arrests, some cheering, some in disbelief. For so long, the HOA had ruled over the neighborhood with ridiculous fines and rules. Now they were paying for their actions. The trooper walked through the neighborhood, watching as people slowly came out of their homes, their faces filled with relief. The oppressive weight of the HOA was finally gone, and the air felt lighter, more relaxed. He saw neighbors talking to each other in the streets, sharing stories about how they had been fined for silly things like having too many weeds or leaving their trash cans out a minute too long. The laughter and conversations flowed freely, a stark contrast to the fear and tension that had once gripped the community. As the last of the HOA board members were led away, the trooper took a deep breath. It felt good to see them go. For years, the HOA had used fear and control to make people follow their rules, punishing anyone who didn't comply. Now their reign was over. The community was finally free. The next few days were full of changes. Without the HOA's control, the neighborhood started to return to normal. People could park their cars without worrying about tickets, lawns could grow without constant trimming, and families could enjoy their property without the looming threat of fines. The trooper could feel the shift in the air, a sense of relief and freedom spreading throughout the community. And for him, the best part was knowing that justice had been served. The HOA members were facing their punishment, and the community was stronger for it. The trooper stood back and watched, feeling the sweet taste of victory. The plan was simple but meaningful. He gathered a few neighbors who were just as eager to make the change, and together, they began transforming the old office building and the surrounding area. They tore down the old structure, getting rid of the constant reminder of the HOA's control. In its place, they built picnic tables, set up a barbecue area, and planted trees and flowers. They even put up a big sign at the entrance that read, HOA Free Zone, as a reminder of how far they had come. The trooper worked alongside everyone else, feeling a sense of pride as the park began to take shape. People who had been too afraid to speak up in the past now came together, eager to be a part of the change. It felt like a new beginning for the entire neighborhood. The oppressive rules of the HOA were gone, and in their place was a space where people could gather, relax, and enjoy their property without fear of fines or judgment. The day the park was finished, the trooper couldn't help but smile. The community had worked together to create something positive, something that would bring everyone closer. To celebrate, they planned a big barbecue and gathering. It was the first event in the new park and it was a huge success. Neighbors who had once been divided by the HOA's petty rules were now sitting together, sharing food, stories, and laughter. The air was full of joy and the atmosphere was one of unity and freedom. The trooper watched from the side, a feeling of contentment washing over him. He realized how much had changed. The fear and tension that once hung over the neighborhood had been replaced with a sense of community and belonging. People were no longer worried about getting fined for minor mistakes or following ridiculous rules. They were free to be themselves and enjoy their homes. As the sun began to set, the trooper sat on one of the picnic benches, reflecting on everything that had happened. It had been a long road, but they had done it. They had taken back control of their neighborhood and turned it into a place where everyone could live freely, without the constant pressure of the HOA. Looking around at the happy faces of his neighbors, the trooper felt a deep sense of pride. The HOA may have tried to tear them apart, but in the end, it had only brought them closer together. This was a new chapter for the community, one filled with hope, freedom, and unity. And for the trooper, that was the best reward he could have ever asked for. The court case was finally underway, and the once powerful HOA members were about to face the consequences of their actions. The state trooper sat in the courtroom, watching as Mrs. Pennington and the others nervously shuffled in. The atmosphere was tense, and the air was thick with anticipation. The courtroom was packed, with people eager to see how the trial would unfold. The trooper couldn't help but feel a sense of satisfaction knowing that these people, who had once controlled the neighborhood with their fines and ridiculous rules, were now in a place where they couldn't escape the law. The prosecution wasted no time. The security footage was shown in full view of the court, and the entire room watched as the HOA members were seen pouring gasoline on the trooper's police car, laughing as it burned. There was no denying what had happened. The footage was clear, and their attempts to justify their actions fell apart almost immediately. Mrs. Pennington tried to argue that they had been trying to enforce community rules, but no one in the courtroom was buying it. She claimed the fire had been an accident, but the judge wasn't convinced. "You expect me to believe that 6 grown adults accidentally set fire to a police vehicle and stood by laughing?" the judge asked, shaking his head in disbelief. Mrs. Pennington stammered, but there was no escaping the truth. The evidence was overwhelming and the judge quickly delivered his verdict: guilty. The sentencing followed soon after. Some of the HOA members were given probation, hefty fines, and community service. But others weren't so lucky. Mrs. Pennington and a few of the more active board members received jail time for their role in the arson. The trooper watched as Mrs. Pennington, once so confident and powerful, was escorted out of the courtroom in handcuffs. She looked as though the world had come crashing down on her, and in a way it had. The community that had once feared her now watched her fall from grace. For the trooper, the sense of justice being served was incredibly satisfying. These people had used their power to control others, ruining lives with their petty rules and fines. But now they were facing the full weight of the law. It was a sweet victory, not just for him but for the entire neighborhood. As the court session ended and the courtroom began to empty, the trooper sat back and thought about everything that had happened. He had spent so much time dealing with the HOA's tyranny, but now it was over. The community was free and the change was already visible. People were no longer afraid to live their lives on their own terms. The victory wasn't just about seeing the HOA members punished. It was about restoring peace and freedom to the neighborhood. For the first time since moving in, the trooper felt like he truly belonged. The community had come together not just to fight the HOA, but to support each other and create a better place to live. The weight of oppression was gone, and in its place was a sense of unity and hope. The trooper smiled to himself, knowing that he had played a part in making the neighborhood a better place for everyone. It was a victory that felt even sweeter because it wasn't just about justice, it was about giving people their freedom back.